Yo guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel, or welcome if you've never been here before. So I've just jumped on today, like I do every week, to create my weekly forecast, and this weekly forecast is going to be for the week commencing the 17th of January and ending on the 21st of January. So I'll be forecasting these 6 pairs and what's going to happen in the Forex market this week. But just before I jump into the forecast, I will just draw your guys' attention to the written version of this forecast. So I do put effort into making the written version of this analysis so that I know what I'm talking about when I come on to make the video version instead of just doing it when I get to the screen. And I will be linking this written version of the analysis in the video description. So if you guys are interested in the written version of this analysis and you want something you can print off or just use a reference point that's actually written and not just for video, then please do check out this written analysis because I do think it provides quite a bit of value. So if you guys are interested in that, that'll be linked in the video description. Alright, so let's get started with the forecast. Alright, so first thing I'm going to do is Nzdusd. So looking at the daily on Nzdusd, we have this break structure to the low, and then we broke structure again to the low again, and then, like I've been speaking about the last few weeks, we've had this break of structure on the high here. Now, we haven't had a second break yet, just because this candle here wicked above it, but it didn't actually close above it. So for me, we've still only had that one break of structure to the high on Nzdusd. But what we have also got is this liquidity grab down here, so that does add confluence to the overall bullish thesis. So for me, following this break of structure, I'm still looking to take price higher, looking for buys. Now, last week I forecasted this point of interest, and what's happened is we've basically come back down into that point of interest, and then we've now started to move away from it. But like I said, we did fail to actually get that close above. So in terms of the daily range is still from this low here to this high here, and that range is still intact at the minute. So looking at the daily, we still have that point of interest there, which could be basically price could go further into this area before then continuing upwards. So for me, this whole area down here, it's still a valid point of interest. Now, looking at the 4 hour as well, within that area on below, what we've got this imbalance here. So we've got imbalance in this area above this refinement here. So for me, we've still got this whole refinement of that daily point of interest, which hasn't been actually tapped into. So looking at it from that daily perspective, it does make sense to me that we might come further down into this refinement. We'll take out this liquidity here from the relative equal lows that were created last week. And then once we've taken out that liquidity, tapped into here, mitigate this daily order block, then we'll actually see that real break of structure of the high there. So from the daily perspective, that's still definitely a big possibility, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen and see us come and take this liquidity and mitigate this area before we then go higher. But with that said, if we just look from the 4 hour point of view, so last week we were looking at potentially this bearish order block to then come down and actually tap into this area that I'm talking about. Now, what we saw is that that didn't happen, and what we've actually had is price has just accumulated at the bottom there, and then shot up to break structure again on the 4 hour, or sorry, to break structure to the high for the first time on the 4 hour. So considering that we've had that break of structure to the 4 hour, what we can consider is that price has just basically mitigated this area, filled most of this imbalance, and then it's just going to continue higher now, following that more unrefined daily thesis. So seeing this area as basically the mitigation, and then we're just looking to follow price now going higher. So looking at the 4 hour structure, we broke structure to the high, and now what we're looking at is just a pullback, and then we can continue higher. So taking it from that situation, basically we broke structure that originated from this sell move here, so this sell candle, and then the wick of this buy candle. So if we're just looking to follow this 4 hour structure to then go higher to break the daily structure, then buying out of this area makes sense. So for me on Nzdusd this week, it's a pretty simple situation. We're firstly waiting for this retracement into this area here. Once we get that retracement, we can look for buys out of this area following the 4 hour. Now, like I say, we do have liquidity below there. We do have that imbalance which hasn't been fully filled and the refinement of the daily OB. So if this area here, which is the first area I'll be looking to buy from, if that is violated, then we may see price come down into this daily point of interest, the refined daily point of interest, and at that point I'll be expecting buys to come out of this area. But like I said, we've got the 4 hour breaker structure, we've got the 4 hour order block, so for me it makes sense that price is just going to continue buying out of this area. If we do see it come down here though, due to the liquidity there and due to the imbalance and basically the unmitigated order block down here, it still makes sense for price to then violate this 4 hour area, come into the daily, and then we'll buy up from there. But either way, this week, without a doubt, I've got the bullish bias on Nzdusd, and the only thing that would make me change that is if we saw this low here violated and we see the break below it on the daily. But unless that happens with the close below, sorry, on the daily, then I'm definitely in bullish bias and I'm looking to buy out of these two areas. So I will be watching the lower time frame structures this coming week as we go into these areas. Alright, so that's it for Nzdusd. So let's go to AUDUSD. Alright, so AUDUSD, we broke structure to the low, like I've been talking about for the last few weeks. We're still within that whole situation, so we've got this order block up here, which caused that whole move. And when we do get back up to this order block, I'll be expecting a sell move to most likely be coming out of that order block. So when we do get up there, we're still within that sell bias for this impulse correction impulse situation. And when we do get up there, I'll be watching the hourly time frames to see how price reacts and see if we do start to see that structural transition on the hourly time frames. However, in the shorter term, I'm a lot more interested in the 4 hour, and I'll be following the 4 hour structure personally. And then once we do get into the daily point of interest, then we can start thinking more about what's happening on that higher time frame. So looking at the 4 hour structure, right, we had a break of structure here, and then we've basically had a mitigation there of the order block that caused this break of structure. Now we've then had, after the mitigation, another break of structure, right, which left behind this order block here. So the fact we have the mitigation with the two breaks of structure, that's what gives us this order flow invalidation line, because this is where the bullish order flow currently situated. So for me, if we do come down towards this area, it makes sense that we're just going to keep buying up to continue this bullish order flow. But within that situation, what we have seen is we broke to the high, and then we did actually break structure to the high again. So it's not as ideal as if we had just pulled back into this without breaking structure again. But it's still a valid order flow invalidation point, and this is still a valid order block with imbalance. So for me, when we get into this area, I think we've got a pretty high probability that we are going to see the buys coming up to then take price higher into that daily point of interest. But within the shorter term than that, what we've seen is on our way back down here, we've broke structure on the 4 hour, so we can't ignore this break of structure. And sorry, we've actually broke structure twice on the 4 hour, so we can't ignore these breaks of structure, because technically, while we do have that bullish order flow there, this is technically a structural trend transition. So we could see it that we've even got order flow up here as well. So in terms of AU, the immediate, for me, this order block, this whole thing, is still valid, and I'm sure if we look at it on a slightly higher time frame, then these breaks of structure won't be valid. But looking at the 4 hour, we do now have also the bearish breaks of structure. So we've got this point of interest here for sells. So we can't ignore that. So for me, if we get into this area, I'll be looking for potential sells. And if we come in from this area down here, then I'll be anticipating buys. So it's not really super clear in terms of this 4 hour on AU, and there's not really much we can do about that, because we do literally have this order flow down here, and then we've got this structure and this order flow up here. So I think really with AU what we do have to do is just watch and just wait and see. And when we do get into these areas, we can look at them lower time frame structures. And if we start to see lower time frame buy structures coming from this area, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with taking buys from that area. And if we start to see lower time frame sell structures coming from this area, then I think it's fine to take the sell from that area. But yeah, overall, in terms of a daily time frame, I do anticipate that we are going to at some point be coming back up to take out this high and then come into this daily order block. So I do think that overall the buy thesis holds more weight. So yeah, for me, ideally, like I've drawn here, what will happen is we'll come up first to do the sells. So we'll come up into the sell point of interest before we tap down here. We can sell away from that to bring us into this area, and then we can buy up from there. But let's see what happens, and like I say, all we can do is wait and see what happens in these areas, and then just keep open minds and be willing to take buys from here and sells from here. So moving on to GU. And guys, if you're enjoying this forecast, and if you do like my content, you want to hear more about my Forex journey, you want to see more of my Forex forecasts, then please do subscribe to the channel, because I do put a lot of effort into these forecasts every weekend. So I really appreciate if you guys subscribed, and I'm really grateful for all of my subscribers. So let's carry on with GU. So pound dollar, we've got a breaker structure to the high. So them supply areas that I've been talking about the last few weeks, we have just completely violated them now. So this whole bullish situation is looking pretty strong really on the pound dollar. So looking from the daily, we've basically got this overall impulsive move which has happened, and that's come from down here. So I mean, in terms of the daily, it makes sense for price to come all the way back down there. And if you look at the 2-day, then you could potentially look at it as more of that whole area. So you're including this candle as well as that smaller candle down there. But yeah, it pretty much does make sense for price to come and retrace, like take out the liquidity below this trend line here. So we might have liquidity below there, and I do think that it will make sense for price to come and take that liquidity out at some point. But that said, it doesn't have to, and we do have quite efficient pricing throughout this area, so it's definitely possible that we are just going to be continuing to create new bullish structures on the daily. So considering that and considering the actual distance that it's going to take to get us back down there, I do think that it's worth just following the 4-hour structure for now, and then if we do see that bearish trend transition on the 4-hour, then we know where we can be targeting before we do see that reversal. But for now, I think just following these 4-hour structures is definitely the best way to go with the pound dollar. So looking at the 4-hour, the last two breaks of structure have been 2 consecutive bullish breaks of structure. So taking that into account, that's basically left behind 2 valid order blocks that we could buy from. So we've got this first candle here, which caused this most recent break of structure. That's also got imbalance above it. So for me, this makes perfect sense, and this would be really the ideal point for me for us to see a continuation from, and then we can target a new break structure to the high. But if that doesn't happen, and if we do violate this area, then I do think that some type of bullish reaction from this whole sell move here, which is a sell to buy move, I do think that that will make sense. So initially what I'm going to be looking at is buys out of this area. But failing that, and if we then come into this area, I will be looking for buys out of this area. So let's see what happens on GU. I mean, you can look at a lot of the areas within this whole channel here. You can see them as basically valid demand zones. But for me, if we do see the break below here, and especially if we see the break below there as well, I'll be looking at how the 4-hour structure is developing, because at that point we'll have had at least one break of structure to the low on the 4-hour, so we will also have some fresh supply areas higher up. So for me right now, it's just a case of looking for buys from these two areas, and then if we do see the bearish breaks coming in, then I will be aware of potential supply areas which may develop, for example, if we did just see the violation of this area immediately when we open up on Monday, then this area here will become a valid order block to sell away from. But as it stands right now, I'll just look for buys out of this order block and out of this order block, and I'll take it from there, see what happens. Alright, so moving on to Euro Dollar. So Euro Dollar, we've now had, so we had the break structure on the daily, and like I was talking about, I was expecting basically price to buy up out of this area. Now I was hoping that we would actually come deeper into it than we actually did, but we didn't, and we've just come to roughly 50% of this whole order block, which I mentioned from the daily time frame, and then we've seen that next break of structure. So now we've seen 2 consecutive breaks of structure on the daily. That's confirmed a trend transition, so we know for a fact now that we're going for the bullish thesis on the daily, the bullish bias, sorry, and I don't think we're very likely to see the sells come through yet. Like I do still think that this is a valid order block and a valid supply zone. So when we get up into this area, that's when we might see the sells coming through. But until we get into that area, I think we've got a very clear bullish bias due to these 2 consecutive daily breaks of structure. So just looking from the daily in terms of where did this second break of structure come from, it basically came from that whole leg down there, so that whole sell candle down to the bottom of this wick here. So really it makes sense, and like we saw with that one, like you can try and refine it if you want, but it really does make sense for price to come from anywhere within this whole area and then start buying up. So you've got to be aware of the hourly structures in terms of what's happening when we do get into this whole range here. So definitely worth being aware of the 1 hour, 2 hour, 4 hour when we're within this range here, and then we can look for them potential transitions of trend to then continue buying, and then we can look to target this imbalance up here, because I do think that this next push to the high is going to be filling most likely this imbalance. But I will just for now, so remember that guys, that it could come from anywhere within this whole area, but I will just delete this this rectangle for now because it does just clog the screen up a bit. So looking at the 4 hour, what we've now had is also, along with this daily break of structure, it was also a 4 hour break of structure, and that 4 hour break of structure was clearly caused by this order block here. So we've got sell to buy, and that's an order block. That order block's also got imbalance, and that order block also ties up with this 4 hour order block on pound dollar, and obviously the pound dollar and euro dollar are very heavily correlated, so it's always nice when you see multiple order blocks tying up together like that. So in terms of the 4 hour, the first thing I'm looking at on euro dollar is to buy out of this area. And then if that area is violated, then what I'll be looking at is for basically a buy out of this area here, which for me is another refinement of the daily point of interest. And the reason why this is a refinement is because we've got this wick trick here and we've got imbalance above that area. So for me, it makes sense for price to come out of there to follow the daily structure if we do see price violate this 4 hour structure. And if we did violate both of these points, then then we will still be within the whole daily range, because we know that we've got our daily low down there. So that's pretty much our thesis invalidation point. So in terms of looking to buy in general, coming from anywhere until we violate this point makes sense, because we do have that overall bullish bias, and that bias is valid until we see a close below this point here. So that's why I've then got this next refinement drawn on. So if we violate this area and we violate this area, then I'll be looking at this wick here as the area where I'm expecting price to most likely come from. And the reason why it's that wick is because this wick grabs liquidity below this wick here, and it is the extreme of this overall sell move, which then causes the overall buy move. So yeah, for me, all 3 of these zones are valid, and initially I'll be watching how price reacts to the 4 hour order block. But if we do violate that, then I'll be watching how price reacts to these 2 refinements of the daily order block. And then hopefully we can look to then take the buys to follow that daily structure. So wherever they come from, I'm only looking really for buys on EU. Not too interested in sells because I do think that we are going to follow through with that daily bullish bias. So that's EU, guys. And if you guys are finding any of this confusing, then do just check the written version of this analysis because that's got all this information in. So if there's something that I've not really explained that well, it's probably written in a better format in the written version. Alright, so moving on to pound yen. So pound yen, we're still within that whole daily break of structure situation that I've mentioned in the last couple of weeks. So we broke structure to the daily. Now, in terms of that break of structure, it could be seen to have come from this candle here. You could see it to potentially have come from this candle here, or you can see it to have come from the extreme. So in terms of following bullish structure on the daily, I'll be looking for buys out of initially this area here, and then failing that, I'll look to buy out of this area if we do end up back down there. And then if both of them are violated, then I'll still be looking for buys on the daily out of this area because that is the extreme point of interest. But like I've spoke about the last few weeks, and it's the same on GU, you know, I do think that it's unlikely we're going to be coming back down to revisit this extreme anytime soon, just because of how far away it is. So for me, it's not something that I'm majorly interested in. But if we do end up down there, I mean, then that means that we've got a huge move to come to the downside. But let's see what happens in terms of that. And I'm definitely aware of this base here, which definitely could be a reaction point for price to then continue higher on the daily. But let's look at the 4 hour because I do think the 4 hours more relevant in the shorter term than what's going on this daily time frame. So last week I spoke about this point of interest up here, and what we've seen is the perfect reaction from the wick of that point of interest. So we saw price initially, we got this reaction from the open, but then later in the week price came back up to take liquidity from above here, and then it's reacted off a wick before breaking structure again. So that move played out really well, and if you guys were watching last week, that's one of the great things about having this liquidity grab. Even though we only had that one break of structure, because we'd had a liquidity grab before the break of structure, that does add a decent amount of probability, I think, to basically getting that reaction and the follow through from that area. So looking at this week's structure though, we've now got our second break of structure coming through, so that confirms essentially order flow and structure transition to bearish now. So we know that looking at the 4 hour on pound yen, we're definitely in a bearish bias now. Now it is kind of interesting here on pound yen because if we look at the actual 4 hour structure, the 4 hour high is here. So considering that, what we should expect basically is for price to just immediately start selling off pretty much when we get into the start of next week. Now, if we look at the 1 hour, we can maybe refine. So we can say that price will come up to here before it starts selling off. So we might just see at the start of the week, price will trickle up there, and then it'll start to sell off from there to follow that 4 hour structure. Now, that I think is probably the first situation to be looking at, and for me, I'll be more than happy if I do see my lower time frame setup coming through. I'll be more than happy to take sells out of that area, targeting as a first target that daily area for buys. But with that said, on the 4 hour, I can see that we've got this imbalance here, so that is kind of suspect in a way because what if we're going to see price coming down there, you'd prefer not to see imbalance really there because that imbalance is essentially like a magnet for the price to come up higher to fill the imbalance. So looking at that, I did also just look at the 5 hour time frame to see if there was any other types of structure. And on the 5 hour, what we can see is the structure's almost identical. So we've got break of structure 1, break of structure 2. So we know we've got this order flow and structure transition coming through. But instead of having our high here and our order flow and structure high here, we've actually got it up here instead. So considering that, for me, the 5 hour thesis maybe does look a bit better, because in that if we come up to this point of interest here on the 5 hour instead of going straight from the 4 hour one, then we can fill all the imbalance in between these areas. We can also mitigate this order block up here. So as a first point of interest going into the start of a week, I do think we should be aware of this 4 hour area and look to sell from there. But what I really think is the better situation this week is to look at the 5 hour time frame and basically look to be selling out of this area up here. So that's one on pound yen. We're just going to have to see what happens. But if we do get a break above this 4 hour structure, I will still 100% be in the bearish bias, and I'll be basing that off the 5 hour structure, because I do still think that in terms of what's going on down here, we've still got liquidity below here. We've still got imbalance down here. And I do think that we've also, since we've got this bearish order flow, I do think it just makes sense for us to continue bearish order flow at least until we take out that liquidity and fill this imbalance. So going into the week, I'm basically looking firstly for sells from here, which is a 4 hour point of interest. Failing that, and if we do see that break above, which I do think is quite likely, then I'll be looking for sells from this area up here, which is the 5 hour point of interest. And also in terms of just the price action in general, this is a much better order flow invalidation point in my opinion. So, you know, I do think that we are in bearish order flow until we violate this high up here. So that's why I prefer this area. But yeah, that's pound yen for this week. And like I say, if you are confused in any way, then do just reference the written version. So finally, we've got euro pound. So euro pound, it's literally, it's not really changed from last week. I mean, we've literally just seen consolidation at the low. So the thing is, in terms of consolidation at the low, like we kind of saw it here. So that's something that can happen before you see that counter trend move to come up to mitigate. So I think if you're looking at it that way, there is this added chance that we are going to come back up now. But looking at the 2 day, we had our break structure 1, break structure 2. We've now had another breaker structure, as I spoke about previous weeks, and that's left behind this order block here, and it's also left behind the order flow invalidation line up here. So looking at the 2 day, and it's the same structure on the daily, but I like the 2 day on euro pound. So looking at the 2 day, we are just expecting essentially a counter trend move now to come back up into this area. Then once we get into this area, we can look to sell off. And in terms of targets for that overall sell-off, still looking at this liquidity from the weekly and also this order block down here. So I think I think a pullback and then a sell-off on the 2 day is what I'm really expecting to happen with euro pound. But that said, it doesn't have to pull back, and it can just continue down to take out that liquidity without coming up here to mitigate this order block. So we'll have to see what actually happens on the euro pound. But this order block is valid, and if we do get back up here, then I will be anticipating sells and most likely taking sells to then take us further down into the weekly structure. But just looking at the 4 hour on euro pound, so like I spoke about on pound yen, right, we had the liquidity grab and then we had a breaker structure that left behind this area, and due to that liquidity grab, it does add confluence. Now looking at the euro pound here, what we can see is we've got this liquidity grab at the low. So we've had this like consolidation or accumulation, if you want to call it that, and then we broke structure to the low again. But following that, we actually saw a break of structure to the high. So at that point, we can see this here as a liquidity grab. So we can imagine that below these equal lows, there was a lot of liquidity. When price broke that structure, it's liquidated, all the liquidity under there, grabbed the liquidity, and then it started to move off in the other direction. So considering that on the 4 hour, and considering that we've got this point of interest up here with imbalance that we're basically waiting for price to come back to, I actually do like the overall buy thesis going into this week on euro pound. So going into the week, I think some type of buys out of this area absolutely makes sense, and I think it's worth just watching the lower time frame, see if we can get that lower time frame structure transition, and if that happens, then I'd love to take buys back up to then take us up to that 2 day point of interest. But yeah, we'll have to see on euro pound. And the thing is that if you know, I do think that this is a liquidity grab and then break structure, so I do think it's going to make a lot of sense for us to come back higher. But you can't ignore that we are literally just moving down, and then we've just got a consolidation, so it could definitely just continue down as well, following all this bearish momentum. But considering the way that I analyse and the fact we've got a liquidity grab and a break of structure, I do think that this bullish thesis is a really nice idea on the euro pound. Alright guys, so that's it for this week's forecast. I hope you enjoyed the forecast. If you did, then please subscribe to the channel, because like I said, I do put a lot of effort into these and I do release them pretty much every week. I don't think I've missed a week yet. So if you guys want to see more forecasts, then please subscribe. And if you guys want to check out the written version, that'll be linked in the description. And there's a lot of other links in my description as well if you're newer to Forex or if you want to learn more about Forex. And there's some great stuff in there as well about trading psychology. So if you struggle with your trading psychology, please do check out the links in the description, because there's some really valuable resources there. Alright guys, so thank you very much for watching this week. Please subscribe if you did enjoy it or if you want to see more. And I'm very grateful for you viewing this video. So I hope you guys all have a safe trading week, stick to your trading plans, and have a good one. So thanks guys.